Good morning. Thank you for being here this morning. We are going to finish up Colossians that we've been studying for the last month or so. So we'll be picking up in 3:18, going through that family section, that Christian households, which is what we were talking about last Sunday. So we're going to finish that up and then try to get through the end of Colossians, but we'll see. We'll see where we get to. Wade, could I ask you to lead a prayer for us? Amen. So we might be going without the PowerPoint, and that's perfectly fine. So we're going to pick up in Colossians 3 and verse 18. We talked last week about kind of what the households were like, how they're different from how our households are today, how the families are different, the structure and the dynamic were different, the size was different. They had kind of one big household with everyone underneath it, which was servants and adult children. And so just the households that we have today are different. And we just have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about these rules for Christian households, or the ways that we're supposed to conduct ourselves in the earthly roles that we have as Christians, which is what Paul's talking about. And so last week we talked about husbands and wives. And I think the main takeaway from that was especially to look to ourselves as husband, wife, that we are supposed to be doing what God wants us to do ourselves, not like pointing fingers and blaming each other, which is what we can often turn to sometimes, but to just look to ourselves and make sure that we're fulfilling what God has asked us to do. So picking up in... looking through my notes from last week, picking up in chapter 3, verse 20, it says, "Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord." Now, if you remember from last week, we also wanted to look at the two, well, I guess for this one, it's just one other passage, Ephesians chapter 6, if you'll turn there real quick. Ephesians 6. Can I get somebody to read verses 1 through 3?
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise, so that it may go well with you, and that you may enjoy long life on the earth.
Thank you. So it's basically the same thing in these two different passages, Colossians 3:20, Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Obey your parents in the Lord. Colossians 3 says, "In everything, for this pleases the Lord." And Ephesians 6 says, "Honor your father and mother." And he references the commandment from the law of Moses and how that's supposed to be. But my question for us, talking about children, we're not children. This is the adult class, so it's literally the opposite of what we're talking about. But is there still something we can take from this section or from this verse of how children are supposed to be, or the role children are supposed to play? Yeah.
And I think as a parent, it shows that I need to not only raise them to obey, respect, but help them to understand why, and help them to connect the dots as they get older. When they're little, you can't really reason, but as I've got teenagers now. Let's have a conversation about this so that they understand why. And sometimes it's just because I said so, and they need to take that. But I think it shows that we've got a bigger job than just bossing somebody.
Yeah, exactly. And that probably goes with the in the Lord part of, if you're not explaining why and they're just doing it blindly, how are they supposed to obey in the Lord? What if you tell them to do something that's not according to God, which shouldn't do anyway, but
Well, as children, we're talking about children, you asked the question, why are we talking about children? Because we're not children, we're adults. But we are children of God, and
Yeah, absolutely. And we're children of God. That's a great point. I was going to say, and he's kind of hitting on this, like, how does age play into this? What defines a child? Is a child until they're 13, 18? In a sense, like, we still have parents. So in a sense, we're still children now, not children in and of ourselves, but children of our parents. And so how does that play into it? Is there something there that we should think about? Yeah.
I think about Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. It says to honor your parents. And honoring isn't just obeying. Honoring is respecting and caring for and loving. So those are things that we can also do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah.
The other side of that to me is, okay, if I have these things I need my kids to be doing for me, I see what I need to be doing with God. Like, here's my relationship with you. How can these demands be made of my kids, yet I'm not meeting the same demands from God?
Yeah. So I guess almost like looking, the same thing we talked about last week, looking at ourselves in a sense of, I guess if we're asking unreasonable things or that we wouldn't even do with God for our children, are we being obedient to God as we want our children to be to us as parents? That's a good thought. Anything else from this parents or this children section? The next section we have is, it says specifically fathers. That's the word he uses, not mothers, which we'll talk about in a moment. Could someone read verse 21 here in Colossians 3?
Fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged.
And then can someone do Ephesians 6, verse 4?
And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord.
All right. So, again, this one's pretty similar as well, the two different comparisons in Colossians and Ephesians, where it says, do not provoke your children, basically. So, I'm looking at the questions I've got here. One of the questions I had when I was looking through this or reading through it is, why aren't mothers mentioned here? Like, was that intentional? Did you just kind of overlook it? Why does he only say fathers?
If they're the head of the house and leading and seen as the authority figure, then when something comes down the pipe that the parents have decided to move on, it's going to look like it's, well, they're like the dad, I guess.
Yeah, so as the head of the household, it comes down to the father to be making sure that things are right. And I think that, again, that kind of goes back to the husbands and wives section and also what we talked about with households, that men as the head of the household, like, there's a lot of responsibility there, and to look to yourself to make sure you're doing the right thing. That's really, I think that's one of the biggest contrasts Paul makes here between men and women, and in these earthly roles for us as Christians. That is a huge thing that I think Paul sets apart, that men, as the head of our household, as the husband, as a father, we are supposed to look to ourselves. We are supposed to make sure we're doing what's right. Of course, that's true for all of us, but I think he sets that apart to make that point. Yeah.
I think, like, when I think about when our kids were younger, and I think about Rob, and it was like a heavy weight that he felt, that he was responsible for these little souls, and that, he wanted them to be good, and he wanted them to love God, and as the head of the household, I think he felt that more, I don't want to say more deeply, but it was more of a heavy burden for him than it was for me.
Yeah, I was thinking beforehand that I'd written down that I think maybe part of the reason he says is fathers might be more prone to anger. That's kind of just an emotion men tend to struggle with more, and so that might have been the reason. But I didn't even think about that, that the fact that, as we're discussing, as the head of the household, and you feel that weight, that responsibility of bringing up your family in the Lord, certainly that can make you more prone to being to provoking your children or having anger, discouragement. That's a great point. I was just looking. Look at Hebrews chapter 12. And could I get someone to read? I don't have it up there. Hebrews 12, starting in verse 4. Because what I think this is, it's a different letter, it's a different book. But I think this is also a good, the standard, the parenting God's way. And specifically here, it's talking about the way that the Lord parents as a father. So could I get someone to read verses 4 through 11 of Hebrews 12?
In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. The Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it.
Thank you. So, just looking at this passage, does anything immediately stand out to you? What do you think is a good takeaway from this passage, or several takeaways?
God will yield peace and fruit. Like it's not worth its while if it's not producing change or something good.
Yeah. You said producing peace and fruit, is that what you said? Yeah. So producing fruit, producing peace, that if discipline is what you're saying, if that's not producing those things, then what purpose is it serving? How useful is it? So comparing that to the Lord's discipline of us. John, did you have something?
Yeah. One thing that stood out to me is that he says, they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. And that's like kind of a limitation of a earthly father, is that you can only discipline for a short period of time. But God is able to discipline us throughout every period of our life. And like a period of discipline, you could say, could last like 10 or 15 years. And that's something that you can't have with just like actual physical father.
Right, yeah. So, kind of combining what you and Morgan were saying, I just noticed verse 11 is what Morgan specifically was talking about. The moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it. So this point of discipline, the point of fathering, whether it's God fathering us or us fathering our earthly children, it's for training in righteousness. And so it's supposed to be yielding these things peaceful fruit. Yeah.
I'm just looking at, if you're disciplining, it might be either consequences or spankings or whatever it is at the time, but you're also reproving with it everywhere God lists it. So you're not just harming or frustrating or exacerbating your child, but you're explaining why. And then it says, the world would think that this would be the opposite, but God says it actually produces respect
And that's the way that God designed it to be, right? Just as he is our Father and he disciplines us, not so that we hate him or are angry with him, but he disciplines us in a way that helps us, that trains us. And we're supposed to model that in our earthly relationships as parents, as fathers. And doing that properly as well, just as God set up, so that there's a respectful relationship there, not bitterness and anger being provoked to discouragement, right? So again, yeah, God's relationship with us is just like parents' relationship to children. That's what he's trying to say.
I think also we see a world now that doesn't have discipline. It's just a mess. So I think, there needs to be a fatherly figure and there has to be discipline. And I think probably one of the worst things a parent can say is, because I said so. I think there needs to be an explanation of why instead of just because I said so.
Yeah, that's a great point. Verses 7 and 8 basically says that it's for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. So we receive discipline because God is our Father. He's treating us as his children, as his sons. And so, right, we look at a world today where there is probably a very good lack of discipline in a lot of youth, and just all over the place. And that isn't just from earthly fathers. That's a big thing from earthly fathers, of course. But I think it's good for us to pay attention to that for ourselves, that are we accepting the Lord's discipline? Are we allowing that? Like if we're trying to get away from it, if we're trying to refuse it, just like he says here, we're not legitimate children. We're not sons. So if we won't take the Lord's discipline, then we're not his children, right? Was there a hand back here I saw?
I was going to say when you just said that, I think there's, like an implicit message here that's not outwardly stated that we, especially as we get older, because that we need to be willing to receive that discipline from the Lord. And I say that especially as we get older, because I think sometimes we think, oh, well, I'm 40, 50 years old, I've lived a lot of life. That discipline is just for the kiddos or for younger people that don't know any better. And it's not. It's especially if it's coming from God. It's for everybody, and we need to have that open and willing heart to receive that instead of wanting to reject it like the world would want us to do and so often does.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think what stood out to me there was verse 10 specifically. The reason that God disciplines us is that we may share his holiness. And what does that mean exactly? Well, holiness is set apart. So set apart to be his people. He's training us to be like him. He's making us like him. So that's why he disciplines us.
I think it also points to that, it's very important for there to be a father role model, because without a role model, there really is not great discipline. Like, your mom can only discipline you as much as you can. When I was little and I got in trouble, I would much rather take a spanking from my mother than from my father, because I knew that, A, she can't hit me as hard. Not that he hit me really hard, but, he got my point across more than my mom would. And so I think nowadays there's a lack of fatherly role models, and that's why the Lord is speaking to the fathers, because to be a role model you have to be present, and there's just not a whole lot of that.
Yeah. And it makes me think of, since you just mentioned that, because this was written during a different time. So for us, we really see that today, that with the lack of good father figures and things. But this was written in a different time. So it just makes me wonder, what the situation was back then of how fathers were actually doing. Were they doing a good job raising their children? I don't really have an answer to that. I don't know exactly what that looked like. But I'm sure that the Christians, and they knew when they're reading this letter, they're reading the letters from Paul, that they had an understanding of how they're supposed to be and what things are going wrong. So I'm not sure if, that was a problem for them then. It very well might have been. But I think that's really important for us to consider, especially as men for a moment, like as fathers, that is so important that children need a father figure. Of course they need mother as well. God designed it to have both. That's exactly the way God set things up to be. So we can't discount the importance of that. Yeah, Scott.
Outside of punishment, discipline, when I think of it, it's kind of like discipleship. I'm saying it's the following of whoever you're, think of like a kung fu school. You're under their discipline. But it's not just the physical, it's also the mental state. So when you discipline children, you're also teaching them to accept no. You're also teaching them to have discernment. You're teaching them to take responsibility for their actions. And I think it's also talking about, you do this now so that later on, because if you don't do that when they're young, they won't know how to navigate through life, or, ultimately, the goal is for us as physical, earthly parents to teach them how to trust in the Lord as they go through life, and increase in that relationship, and accept His answers, accept His guidance, and to trust in Him and not themselves. So,
Yeah, yeah.
when I read it, I tend to go towards the discipline, fatherly correction, but there's a bigger picture of discipline in just leadership and showing them how to emotionally and mentally cope with things.
Yeah, yeah. The point of, it's not just physical, of course, it's not just physical discipline. That's something that is set up as well and it's talked about. But yeah, of course it's mental, and we think that with God too. I guess maybe there's some way that physically we're disciplined by God, but mostly it's mentally. It's by the things that we go through, the experiences that we have, the struggles, and Shelby and I were talking about this morning, James chapter 1, about suffering, which produces righteousness, or produces steadfastness. And so just the things that we go through, that God lets us go through, that He uses to discipline us, and that creates in us the character that He has. And He wants us to be like Him. And so again, the measure of success, it seems to be what the Hebrews writer is saying and what Paul is saying in both Colossians and Ephesians, is the measure of success for parents, for fathers, is to be like God, to parent the way God parents, to be a father like God is. And that's true for all of these relationships. That's what we're seeing over and over again, whether it's husbands, wives, children, parents, bondservants, masters, whatever earthly relationships we have, we're supposed to be like God. We're supposed to act like God in those relationships, do the things that He's done. That's the whole point of what we're going through. Any more comments on this parenting father section?
In verse 8, he was talking about if we're left without discipline, then we're illegitimate children and not sons. And he was talking about if God didn't discipline us. And I was thinking about that in an earthly sense. Like, I'd say that the temptation has been to minimize my discipline of one particular child right now. It seems like it's not having its effect yet. And but if God stopped disciplining us, it'd be like saying, yeah, you're like physically my son, but not really, and just left that child alone to
Yeah.
just go through life. But we can't give up.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think going along with what Emily was saying about how fathers have just abandoned their children, they're quitting, they're giving up. They're just saying, well, this is too hard, my kid won't listen to me, and they just stop trying. Adam?
Yeah, back in Colossians, I was just kind of rereading this whole paragraph, and it just reminds me of how Jesus, when He's setting up His kingdom, He says, you know that the Gentiles like to lord over each other. If anybody
Yeah, that's a great point. If you look at Ephesians, where we were looking at the section where it has wives and husbands, children and parents, bondservants and masters, right before that, in chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, he says, "Be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." And I think that those two verses kind of preclude this whole discussion about family, that we're supposed to be imitators of God and walk in love as Christ loved us. We're supposed to be like God. We're supposed to be like Christ. I mean, what better summary can we have of our earthly relationships, of being a Christian in our earthly relationships? That's about what you can boil it down to. We're supposed to, whatever we see God doing, whatever we see Christ doing, that's how we're supposed to be. Anything else from this?
From the Hebrews passage, it's got in verse 9 the phrase "and live." And then in verse 10, it's got "for our good, that we may share his holiness," like you mentioned earlier. And all of this, as God is being viewed, or God is depicting himself for us as a father to children, and us Christians as children. It seems what is on the line is life and death, and thus the importance and value of it, of how willing are we to try to get to our child's heart. Well, how willing was God? Well, he showed us in Jesus' life how willing he is to get to our hearts by living among us and sharing this history for us, and then putting people in our lives whose hearts have been transformed to this. And as I think about what does this look like, if I were to kind of distill this down to a life and death thing, and the responsibility of a father, it would be sacrifice and joy. Because what God did was sacrifice. And as you think about his response to those who repent of sin and change away from sin and come into his light, there's more joy in heaven over one sinner that repents than 99 that need no repentance. And
It's-
so I see, and I think about myself as a father naturally, Max and Bryn, anything that they're enjoying, or anything they enjoy that's good and wholesome, that's my joy. And the same is for God. That's their joy. Anything that they're struggling with and sacrificing and having to endure, I'm right there with it. And it's impactful to see God in that light.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny that you say sacrifice and joy, because at the beginning of this chapter, Hebrews 12, verse 2, it says, "Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." So again, whether it's sacrifice and joy, or there's probably a whole list of characteristics and qualities that we could have to implement and to be like God and to be like Christ as we parent our children. I can't take any more comments on this section. We got to move on to bondservants. So can I get somebody to read each of those passages, starting with Colossians 3?
Colossians 3, starting verse 22. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality.
And go on Ephesians.
Slaves, obey your human masters with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart, as you would Christ. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ. Do God's will from your heart. Serve with a good attitude as to the Lord and not to people, knowing that whatever good each one does, slave or free, he will receive this back from the Lord.
And then 1 Peter.
Submit yourselves to the Lord's, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether to a king, as to one in authority, or to governors, as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond slaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor if, for the sake of conscience towards God, a person bears up sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if, when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if, when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return while suffering. He uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you return to the shepherd and guardian of your souls.
Thank you. Any initial thoughts on this, on these three passages about bondservants or slaves?
Well, I know the most obvious thing is that we are not slaves anymore, so it would be easy to say doesn't apply to me, but I think there's so much here, where it talks about, working hard as to the Lord. What we have in employers is a much easier situation, and yet his commands to them were submit to these people even if they're bad masters, and work for the Lord and not for them. And so just application wise, sometimes I hear Christians kind of just talking about giving the very least they can at work or at school or whatever. It's kind of a joke. Or, cheating their employer in some way. And I just think if my guiding principle is that I'm working for the Lord, that should never characterize how I am as an employee.
Yeah, great points. What else?
Just in all these examples, these are all relationships. And I think kind of the theme is, whatever relationship you're in, don't look towards whatever that relationship is with. Think of your relationship with God first. Let him teach you, train you, facilitate that, and honor that relationship first, so that you can perform in whatever role you're in according to his standards and be blessed in doing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, what did we just talk about in the beginning of Colossians 3? That we're supposed to have this spiritual mindset. We're supposed to seek the things that are above. We're supposed to set our mind on things above. And we're supposed to take off the old self and put on the new self. So everything we're doing in all of these earthly roles, all of the things that we do in life, this physical life, because even though we have taken off the old self, the earthly man, the sinful man, and we've put on the new self, which is spiritual and being renewed in the image of God, we still have these earthly roles. We're still living on earth. We're still physical beings. And so we're supposed to go about those things with God in mind. We're supposed to think about him. We're supposed to act like him in these roles. That's a great point, Scott. What else from these passages about bondservants? One of the biggest things that I was noticing from this is I think you can really boil it down to one point. And we think about that, we're not bondservants today. We're not slaves physically. But something that Becky was saying at the beginning here, and I think that comes from 1 Peter 2, where we're not supposed to use our freedom as a cover-up for evil, but live as servants of God. So we're not slaves physically, but we're still supposed to be servants. We're still supposed to be like that towards God. And, there's probably several different passages in the New Testament that talk about these different things about whether we're being slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness. And we have to recognize that we're going to be a slave of something. And so we kind of have a choice about what am I going to be a slave to. So we have to willingly choose to submit to God instead of submitting to other things. And I think when we do that, everything else will fall into place. That went back to Ephesians 5, too, right before we got into that husbands and wives section, specifically where he said, wives, submit to your own husbands. In Ephesians 5, verse 21, it says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So this idea of submission, of being a servant, this goes back to Christ. It goes back to God. And of course, we have Christ's example of humility in Philippians 2. We just see this all around us, that we're supposed to, in all of our earthly relationships, look to Christ, look to God, and we're supposed to be servants. Like, we're going to be slaves, we're going to be servants of one thing or another, so we better make sure that we're servants of God.
I think God is really outlining here. He's saying, wives, submit to your husbands, husbands, love your wives. Fathers, don't provoke your children. Children, respect your parents. And then the servants, he's telling the masters, you have a master in heaven. So he's showing us that no matter what role we are in, husbands, you have to submit to Christ. Children, you will become the father and have to respect your children as well. So no matter what role you're in, it will be flipped. So try your best in every role so that you will be treated accordingly when it is flipped.
Yeah, so thinking about other people, what's like the golden rule of treating others as you want to be treated, that certainly I think would apply here in whatever our earthly relationships are. And again, that just goes back to God. It goes back to Christ, that we're supposed to be treating other people like Christ treated them, like God treated them. Yeah, Lisa.
I love that he takes all of chapter 3 and very specifically tells us how to do it.
Yeah.
You can't just read it and think you
Right.
got it down.
Mm-hmm.
It's something you have to study right
Yeah, that's a great point. Going back to the training idea of God training us, this isn't something that comes easy. It's not something that we just, I'm going to think about it for about 30 seconds and then I'm just going to be, okay, now I'm going to be a perfect parent. Now I'm going to be a perfect husband. Now I'm going to be a perfect wife, whatever it is. We do. That's a great point, that we have to train ourselves for this, and we have to really seek and search and ask God for it. Something Paul repeats all the time in all of his letters is to pray. Pray continually. Pray without ceasing. And he says it, I don't even know how many times here in Colossians, but quite a few. So that'd just be one thing of when we're searching, we're seeking for how to be like Christ, how to be like God in our earthly relationships. We need to ask him for help with that. We got to move on to the master's part because we're not going to get through Colossians at this point. Colossians 4, verse 1. Could I actually get somebody to read each of those verses?
Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you have a master in heaven.
And then Ephesians 6:9.
You masters do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him.
Right. So what do we get from this? Well, like Regan just said, in the Ephesians 6:9 passage, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, there's no partiality with him. So again, it's just going back to the way that we are in our earthly relationships is supposed to reflect Christ. It's supposed to reflect God. And so we should treat others, especially those we have authority over, bringing it into the actual physical relationship we're talking about as masters, whether that be a boss, whether that be as some way in a husband or a father, like the authority that we have in our earthly relationships. Again, supposed to reflect God's treatment of us because he has authority over us. And so we need to look to him. Anything else from this passage? And yeah.
Just life experience. My son's 21, but in raising him through the teenage years, there were times where he's just having a hard time with some aspects of his attitude or whatever. And it occurred to me at some point that maybe I'm being like this towards my Heavenly Father. And maybe he's showing me how this makes him feel. I don't know, this happens to parents sometimes where you, as this is explaining the earthly relationships, but how it is a parallel with our Heavenly Father, there were times where I had to make some changes in myself, which brought about changes in that relationship. So
Yeah.
I think sometimes God does show us through other people or effects of what we're doing, some changes we need to make to be right with Him. He blesses us in our relationship or whatever position we're in here.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, how many times do the prophets talk about how God says his people are committing adultery against him, and that he's comparing his relationship with his people to this earthly relationship of a painful circumstance. And so when we look at our relationships and we're having pain from those, from one of us or both of us not acting the way that we should, like we've been talking about this whole time, we should look to ourselves and we should think, what am I contributing to this? And like Scott's saying, I think that God does show us that the hurtful things in our life are meant to make us look to him. And we have to think about, how am I doing that to God? Like, oh, somebody else hurt me, but it's not like I'm sinless in this. It's not like I'm being perfect. And we have to continually look at ourselves. I think that's one of the biggest things we can take away from this, that it doesn't matter if you're just going to point your fingers at every other person in your life, every other relationship you have. If you're a husband, if you're going to point your finger at your wife, you're going to point your finger at your children, you're going to point your finger at everyone else around you, you're missing the point. And that's true for every single relationship. For a wife, if you're going to point your finger at your husband, you're going to point your finger at your children. If you're a child, you're going to point your finger at your parents. Any of these relationships, if we're just going to point fingers, we're never going to be like Christ. We're never going to be like God. We have to look at ourselves first and purposely, intentionally try to imitate him, try to be like him. I think that's Paul's whole point here. We have to look at ourselves and we have to do our best to be like Christ. I guess that basically brings us to the end of this class, so I guess that's a pretty good way to end it. Sorry we didn't get all the way through. We didn't finish chapter 4, but I've really enjoyed this class, and thank you for your participation.